To all our viewers from the U.S., Korea, and around the world, welcome to Global Money Talk by Sampro TV, live from the New York Stock Exchange. I'm your host, Remy Blair. We'll begin the hour with our market briefing for live coverage of the U.S. markets, and then we will bring you market insights for an in-depth conversation with market experts. Today for the Market Insight, we have Tai Wang, independent proprietary trader, for a conversation on the FX markets. But first, for the market briefing, let's welcome JD Durkin, CBS contributor and host at Public.com. JD, good morning. Great to have you here today.
Good morning. What a day we ended up having yesterday in the session after you and I talked. But a little bit of a nice relief rally, a little bit back today after all that selling. So great to be with you today, and really important, I think, to bring the context of what's moving the markets in real time to all of our viewers today.
Absolutely, JD, because we are seeing the Dow, Nasdaq, S&P 500 in positive territory on this Wednesday morning. And as JD mentioned, we did see a market sell-off in yesterday's session, and the major averages all ended lower for its worst day since the beginning of August.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and I have talked a lot over the last month and on yesterday's show about that big sell-off we had back on August 5th. It was the worst performing session. I think we had a bit of an indication to that yesterday, but then, of course, one of the big stories was the Department of Justice, some of these antitrust concerns against a name like Nvidia. No big surprise here in the U.S. that the Department of Justice tries to get involved from time to time when they sense some of the big tech companies maybe becoming a bit too powerful. I think that put further downward pressure on Nvidia. As we know, Nvidia is so important for many reasons, but chief among them, it's more than 6% of the entire S&P 500. Not really an exaggeration, I think, to say, as Nvidia goes, oftentimes so too go not just the other tech stocks, but oftentimes the market. Helps explain yesterday, but it's nice to have green on the big board today.
Indeed.
And we're seeing a bit of rotation. Actually, the Russell 2000, the small caps are actually slightly outperforming the broader market. Of course, they were disproportionately impacted yesterday. So it's going to be a pretty fascinating session here on Wall Street today.
And JD, I think it would be helpful to take a look at the Nvidia chart, because as you mentioned, we saw a sell-off in yesterday's session, and we saw shares of Nvidia fall by nearly 10% yesterday, and that wiped off a couple $100 billion, and that was over $270 billion, and that is very significant. But if we look at the chart right now, we are seeing Nvidia shares 1.5% higher in today's trading session. So I think that is something to keep in mind. But there are also other names that you're watching, JD.
Yeah, exactly. Well, quick on Nvidia if I can. I mean, it's amazing because we're watching and seeing where Nvidia is trading today at 109. At its earnings last week, this is a stock that was trading up around 122. Obviously, this is a company that had a big stock split earlier this year. So to already see that number come down from where it was down to 109 might be a bit jarring. It is not a stock, if you hold in your portfolio, for the weak of heart. We understand the volatility that tends to happen for a stock like this. Big swings up, big swings down. Right now, the market cap for Nvidia is only $2.6 trillion. Obviously, it had been a lot more. But I think some of the other names that are also worth following are AMD on the day, Intel. We also follow the VanEck Semiconductor ETF, that's ticker symbol SMH. And you look at all these other names, they tend to move in unison, so they go up as Nvidia goes up. They also tend to kind of fall in sympathy as Nvidia struggles. So as you see Nvidia go up, take a look at some of these other names. AMD obviously here having a strong session. I know Intel was down fractionally when we started the morning. It is only down right now about 0.3%. And that VanEck Semiconductor ETF, again, ticker symbol SMH. If you're interested in having some of these big semi-AI plays in your portfolio without latching on to one individual name, an ETF like the one up on your screen is probably a good option. It'll kind of give you a nice weight between names. And we are seeing this ETF today up about 1.3%. Today a little bit better so far.
Let's check in on where stock markets are trading, JD. Right now, we are seeing the major averages all higher on the session, but this does come after a lower open.
Yeah, absolutely. A lower open and a really tough day here on Wall Street yesterday. Remy, you and I came into the broadcast this time yesterday talking about how historically September tends to be the weakest month for equities, specifically this time of year, lower volume, dog days of summer, lots of presumed reasons as to why, and so we sat here, and as we were having that conversation, looking up at the big board, unfortunately seeing a lot of red, but some of those gains now kind of reversing here on this Wednesday on Wall Street.
Indeed, and if we look at the charts for the major stock averages, we are seeing the Dow up by 0.4% on the session, and that does come on the heels of this morning's economic data, which is the JOLTS report. But JD, of course, we're keeping our eyes on non-farm payrolls coming out at 8:30 a.m. on Friday morning, and we will be bringing you the latest on Friday morning. But I think now we can move on to the top news that we're watching from the U.S., and we have two Wall Street Journal articles for you that we're paying attention to. The first being Americans are really bullish on stocks, and that's not surprising given all the gains that we've seen so far this year.
No, I mean, these two stories go kind of, on one hand, they kind of go hand in hand, but they're also seemingly contradictory. You know, on the one hand, I'd argue you have wealthier Americans who in a high interest rate environment, your money has been able to make money in really effective ways in the form of compound interest. You've been more actively involved with equities. Obviously, 2022, we had that disappointing year of a pullback of about 20% or so in the overall S&P 500 as the market first started to navigate the world of interest rates first going up. But then the narrative changed, right? We had the AI revolution. We had hopes of interest rate cuts, which presumably we're a couple days away from in the scheme of things. And so I think that kind of lends itself to Americans having this bullish optimism. But that's if you have skin in the game, which obviously not all Americans do, for direct investment into equities. And then on the other hand are unfortunately Americans who have really struggled not being in the market and have struggled with high interest rates, right? If you are a borrower with high interest rates, your debt has not been this expensive going back now multiple decades. So if you have asset accruing or income accruing assets, you're doing very well. If you're on the other side of that borrower relationship with a bank, you know, we always stress the importance of trying to pay off those credit card bills. And so I think these two stories from the Wall Street Journal kind of show us that on the one hand, yeah, there is reason to be optimistic if you are doing well in this environment. But if you are a more vulnerable American, maybe a lower income tax bracket, you're not really able to take advantage of the gains across Wall Street that a lot of your wealthier counterparts are taking advantage of and enjoying.
And JD, as you mentioned, the two articles, so the first one being the Americans are really bullish on stocks versus retail needs some therapy as cautious consumers trade down. And these are two articles that were published in the Wall Street Journal. And as you mentioned, here in the U.S., we have something that's called the 401k, and some of our viewers may not be familiar with this, but we're hearing about millionaires based on their 401k balances. So tell us a little bit about what that means.
Well, basically, if you have a job here in the United States, oftentimes you could enter in kind of an agreement with your employer where you pay into some long-term retirement funds. Your employer may match up to a certain percent, and it's something that over the course of your working career in the United States, you can kind of accrue a nice bit of extra money where by the time you hit retirement age, you can kind of take advantage of some of that money if you've been keen to store it away for a very long time. And those are the sorts of people who have been doing very well. If you've checked your 401ks, we always say, oh, there are days you don't want to check your portfolios, and there are days you do want to check and see how your 401k is doing. For the most part, those people have been doing very well. And then that other story really, I think, stresses the challenges for a lot of the smaller retailers. We talk about companies like Dollar Tree and Dollar General. They are basically dollar stores where you buy items at significant discounts. Those are the sorts of companies and consumers who have really been struggling. And you know, interesting in the retail space overall, some winners in the last month. Target up 11%. Walmart is up 25% year to date. TJX, which is a discount retailer, the parent company of Marshalls and TJ Maxx, that company is up 25%. So not all retailers here in the U.S. are created equally. Some are certainly doing a lot better than others.
And you bring up an important point, because Dollar General versus some of the other retailers, we know that spending is affected in terms of inflation. Consumers are affected by it and how much they can spend. And you just told us about the bifurcation of spenders here in the U.S., the low-income spenders versus high-income spenders. So what are we seeing when it comes to some of the higher-end retailers out there?
Well, I think a lot of them are probably doing very well. I mean, if you've got money and your money is making money, you're more inclined to spend. I think that's part of the challenge with inflationary pressures overall, is that you know, such a big disproportionate amount of retail spending is being done by wealthier Americans, even as more six-figure income earners are now shopping for their basics at a place like Costco or Walmart than those companies have ever seen before. And that kind of tells us a bit more about the discretionary nature of the American consumer. Obviously, fuel prices still very high, food prices still high relative to a few years ago. Rent prices and mortgage rates are obviously very high right now, so it's interesting to see wealthier Americans kind of pick and choose where to shop for some of those basics, even if that means spending a bit less money on those things to try and make dollars and cents work for their families at the end of each month.
And speaking of dollars and cents, JD, it is a presidential election year, and we're keeping our eyes very close to the ground when it comes to both of the candidates and economic policies. Before I move away from retailers, this year we've been hearing about shrinkflation here in the U.S., so if you buy your usual cup of coffee, perhaps the size, even if it's a tall, if you're going to Starbucks, it might be a little bit smaller. Or if you're picking up a box of cereal or a bag of rice, perhaps there's less in the bag or less in the box. Have you noticed this while you're shopping, JD?
I don't know. I've noticed it more as a storyline that politicians like to talk about. I think anecdotally it's tough because unless you have the exact product from 3 years ago sitting on your shelf at home to compare. But it is something I think specifically we've heard from the Biden White House stress to try and communicate to the average American voter to say this isn't necessarily our fault. Inflationary pressures or not, it's not up to the president to control pricing. Sometimes corporate greed can be a component of it. I think that's part of the message of economic populism overall that these campaigns are trying to take to the American voters with only 60 days and change until the election. It's going to continue to be a big thing they talk about on the campaign trail, I think, for sure.
And I understand that Harris is going to be speaking in New Hampshire on her economic policy. So what do you expect to hear from her speech today, JD?
Yeah, more economic populism, looking to call to expand for the tax deduction for costs that are associated with starting a new business. This is all about small business entrepreneurship. This is something that the Harris campaign is really trying to stress, I think, for voters as well. If you are an entrepreneur, if you start a small business, there are key tax deductions you can take advantage of, and it seems as if Vice President Harris is very keen on expanding those tax deductions and those subsidies for people who are willing to dip their toes into the pool of entrepreneurship. This kind of reminds me of what Harris is saying in places like Nevada right now, the idea of both campaigns, no tax on tips, which speaks specifically to hospitality workers in and around hotels and casinos in Las Vegas, Nevada, trying to win the hearts and minds of those voters. There are messages like that we'll continue to hear out of New Hampshire today as the overall Kamala Harris economic policies continue to take shape.
And JD, for both of those things that you just mentioned, would be entrepreneurs out there who could get a tax break. I think it's really helpful. How much do you think $50,000 really goes? And for viewers out there who might not be used to tipping here in the U.S., whether you're dining out or going out for a drink, you need to pay a tip based on your total, right?
We usually do here, yes, in the U.S., which is something that I think Americans always like when they travel abroad. They think, I don't really have to tip. It's not usually according to how we do things in other countries necessarily, but I think that this is all part of the economic messaging that all these campaigns are going to continue to make. Anything we can do as a campaign or an administration to help take that edge off, make things just a little bit easier for the average American voter or the average American family is going to be tantamount to the type of messaging I think we'll continue to hear. And look for it state by state. Today the address is in New Hampshire. The message might be tweaked. When you get to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, might be a bit different if you're campaigning in a place like Georgia or Arizona, and that's kind of a fascinating part of the puzzle as well, looking at how the messages from each campaigns are being tailored to the exact demographic in each state.
Well, we'll keep our eyes on that, and we'll be bringing you the latest from any speeches that are happening across the country. But I do want to take our sights overseas to Brazil. So we've been hearing the latest when it comes to Twitter or X, and Elon Musk, what he has to say about what's going on in Brazil. So what do you make of that, JD?
A lot of controversy. There's no doubt about it. We are locked in this battle right now between the owner of Twitter, which of course is now known as X, Elon Musk, and not just the leader of Brazil, Lula, but actually the head of what's the equivalent of their Supreme Court in Brazil, who is trying to basically not have people access the platform unless tech companies and tech leaders like Elon Musk play the game in a certain way and meet certain regulatory requirements. Elon Musk has championed himself, for good or for bad, as a free speech hero, as he oversees now the platform formerly known as Twitter. And I think this is going to continue to be a very contentious issue that is spilling out on platforms like Twitter. And, talking with friends in Brazil, they say that they don't have access to the platform unless you use a VPN or something like that. So a lot of scandal and controversy there. The story is going to continue to unfold. And unfortunately, the way Elon Musk fights at times can be a bit gruff. He can use some harsh language, and I think that contentious nature of this fight is going to continue to play itself out.
And of course, we'll keep an eye on what happens as well with that, JD. Yeah. But we'll do a quick market check right now. We are seeing the major U.S. stock averages trade slightly higher on the session, and obviously paring back from gains that we saw earlier when we kicked off the show. The Dow Jones Industrial Averages up by just 0.2%, while we're seeing flat trading for both the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. And JD, as we get closer to the second half of the show, I do want to take a look at what's ahead for the rest of today's session. We have the Fed's Beige Book out at 2 p.m. and of course we'll be keeping a close eye on that as we get closer to that Fed meeting. But what can we expect this afternoon?
Well, I think for the Fed Beige Book, this gives us a reading of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, right? We talk about the overall FOMC, or the central bank at the national level. This kind of gives us our look. We get this information 8 times a year. Let's actually break down the central banks into their 12 regional kind of situations. What does this look like more at the community level? This isn't guidance from the central bank itself. These are sort of surveys they're doing with economists and businesses, and all that information is really important. So I wouldn't argue it's necessarily a huge market-moving event. It certainly can be if investors are otherwise a bit volatile or skittish, but we do get that information at 2 o'clock. It might just give us a bit more context as we get closer to that September 18th FOMC meeting. Of course, that's the big one, Remy, where we're finally expecting those first interest rate cuts. We'll get a bit more information, sort of a look under the hood at the regional level of the central bank. We'll get that information at 2 o'clock today. And then, of course, we don't know what else might be in store. This time yesterday, we could not have foreseen the DOJ Nvidia news that helped drive down stocks. We still have a few key interesting names like Hewlett-Packard set to report earnings after the bell as well. So as soon as we sign off here, we don't know what the rest of the afternoon holds. We get a few key pieces of data and earnings later on in the day, but as we saw yesterday, there could always be a surprise that comes out at 2 or 3 o'clock that ends up moving the market one way or the other.
And absolutely, JD, because as you mentioned yesterday when we were here at the 11 o'clock hour, it was quite different from what we saw in the market close. And Nvidia, the decline we saw in yesterday's trading session, and how much in terms of market value was wiped off with that decline. But in today's session, we are seeing Nvidia shares try to eke out some recovery, although not recovering fully from yesterday's losses. About
right. Nvidia is up 1.3%. Sounds great, but of course, relative to the selling we had, it's all kind of, it all requires that context there. Apple is being hammered on the day, 1.4% in the red. Tech is kind of all over the board. Microsoft's up fractionally, Amazon down fractionally, Meta up fractionally, kind of go name by name. The Dow is interesting right now. United Healthcare Group, we talked about it yesterday, the most weighted name in the Dow. That is up 0.8. Goldman, another highly weighted name, up about 1%. So sometimes you kind of need a little bit of context to understand why the S&P overall might be down, whereas the Dow, which is price weighted, only has those 30 components, might be up, is because some of those more key weighted names are actually doing pretty well. And ironically, in the Dow, the most important names are not tech. It's names like United Healthcare, Goldman, and Home Depot.
And JD, I'm glad you broke that down for us to get a sense of what's really moving the Dow Industrial Average. And of course, tomorrow morning, we'll be bringing you the latest jobs figures ahead of that key employment report coming out on Friday morning. We do get jobless claims as well as ADP, and it is a holiday shortened week here in the U.S., so we do get that ADP report on Thursday instead of Wednesday.
Yeah, that's right.
So we look forward to having you join us again tomorrow, and we will be back bright and early.